welcome back to the channel. I know I've been on a long hiatus. I'm not going to get into any excuses why, but I did want to come back and bring you a quick little something to hold you over, hopefully, even though it's not what I talked about in my last video, but hopefully enjoyable for you nonetheless. So today I'm going to be just talking about my very quick first impressions of the Leica M8. And in particular, this is a Leica M8.2. So I'll just do a quick deep dive into historical context of this camera, some of the features of it, and then I'll get into my first impressions of the image quality as well as my approach. So to start off, my first impressions as somebody who's a current Fuji Sony user and has owned and used a Leica M Type 240. I was actually surprised, because I've never handled an M8 or an M9 for that matter, how similar this experience was to handling the M Type 240. Now, for anyone who's shot Leica for any reasonable amount of time, maybe doesn't come as a surprise to you, because Leica has a long history or heritage with their film cameras all the way to the newest digital M11 that just came out this year, and they pretty much keep the same or very similar design philosophy and approach to them throughout all of those, with small tweaks and minor differences between each generation to the next. But more often than not, if you grew up using a Leica M2 or M3, for instance, if you were to pick up a Leica M11, M8, M9, any of these digital ones, you'd probably feel right at home, and within minutes you'd know how to use it. So maybe not a surprise to anyone who's been in that camp, but with the distance or the age difference between the Leica M8 and the M Type 240, I was actually surprised. I expected it to feel a little bit more different. I expected it to feel older, and in actuality, it kind of doesn't, outside of some of the software features and other little refinements they made, but it feels largely the same. So that was kind of a surprise. For those who've never handled any of those bodies, I would say that it's a very different feel than any other digital cameras that I use or own. For number one, it's very heavy, very, very heavy. This thing, as you can tell maybe in the close-up shots here, is all brass, as you see from the wear here. This kind of patina, as I like to call it, all brass, and that definitely gives it a very hefty feel in the hand, and honestly inspires a lot of confidence in the build quality department. But it's very different. When you pick up cameras after using this one, they kind of feel hollow by comparison. Not that that's bad, because we all like light and portable cameras, or at least I do. But this one definitely gives you some heft. It inspires some confidence. At the same time, it's still pretty compact and light. The body itself isn't huge. It's thicker than the film M bodies and the M10 and M11. However, it's definitely manageable and no big deal. And then of course, with all the lenses being manual focus and having no electronic contacts at all, they're usually a lot smaller. Of course, in combination with the flange distance and other things I'm not going to get into, but they can be constructed and made to be a lot smaller, even though they're still heavy, because a lot of them are still brass. I'm not going to get into all the button placements and things like that, because we'll be here too long, but the basics are that apertures on the lens, like all other M bodies and lens combinations, shutter speed dial on the top, and then your ISO is set from the menu. In particular, you have a quick menu that's accessed through the set button here at the bottom, and you also have a full menu through the menu button near the D-pad here. A couple other things I'll also call out and note here. There is a pretty stiff scroll wheel on the back here that it feels pretty robust, but sometimes very hard to turn, but I would say much better than the scroll wheel found in something like a Ricoh GR3. And then a separate D-pad, not really connected to the scroll wheel, which is once again a welcome improvement over the Ricoh GR3. And then you also have unique to the M8 is this LCD on the top dial, which shows you the battery, the amount of battery left, and the amount of shots left on the SD card. One caveat I'll note really quickly is that LCD for the shots remaining, they only included 3 digits. So the max is 999, Back then, they didn't really have huge SD cards. They didn't really envision a need, I guess, to put a 4-digit, so it won't really give you any indication of shots left until you get below that number. I'll get into what I do about that in a second. Other than that, you have, an optical viewfinder with a rangefinder patch in the middle that is fed by this rangefinder window, a Fresnel little window here that takes the light and uses that to illuminate the frame lines within here, which means that because it's using ambient light, you can look through this viewfinder with the camera off and see your frame lines. And on the front here, you'll see this frame line selector that lets you cycle through different frame lines for different focal lengths and get your preview of that without having to dive in menus or switch lenses, which I also appreciate. And that is mostly it. Very simple. There's other buttons on the back, of course, I won't get into for playback and delete and stuff like that. And then the bottom is like all of the Leica M rangefinders all the way up to the M11, where the bottom comes out, where the old ones used to load the film here, and this you load your SD card and your battery, which I actually really love and appreciate that. It just adds to the nostalgic feel, adds to the tactile process of using it, and I don't find it to be a nuisance at all, because how often do I change my battery or SD card? Not enough for that to matter. And then the added benefit of, if you were to drop this camera and completely dent the bottom, you don't have to send the whole camera in. You can source a new bottom plate and boom, camera's like new again, right? So I like this more than the M11 personally, but I won't get into that here. I'll just leave that alone, since this is just a first impressions video. Other than that, moving on to a little bit about the sensor and the image quality. So the sensor in this camera, while this was Leica's first digital rangefinder, it was not their first digital full frame rangefinder. So what that means is that this has a crop sensor in it. Now, it doesn't have an APS-C like most of us are familiar with these days, right? With the Fuji lineups and Sony's APS-C lineup and so on and so forth. But it has an APS-H sensor. So it's a little bit bigger than APS-C, but not quite as big as full frame. So the APS-C crop factor in comparison to full frame is 1.5, and APS-H, it is a 1.3 crop factor. So what that means is that this 35mm f2 lens that I currently have on this body behaves more like a 45 or 46mm, something to that effect. 45mm lens on a full frame field of view, right? And then a 24 would be like a 28 field of view, 28 would be like a 35 field of view, 35 like a 45, 50 like a 60 something, I believe, 75 more like a, I don't know, a 90 or 80. I don't really worry too much about telephoto lenses because I don't really shoot them on a camera of this style personally. But this does have the equivalent frame lines in the viewfinder, which is nice to have, because you don't have to guess, there's no guesswork there, right? So it has frame lines for the full frame lenses that are 24, 28, 35, 50, 75, and I believe 90. No 135 here. And unfortunately no 40mm frame lines. So like if you use a Minolta 40mm lens on here, anything like that, you'll have to do some guesstimation based on the frame lines present in the viewfinder. But so that's the sensor size and the crop factor there. The sensor was designed by Leica but developed and manufactured by Kodak originally, which kind of adds to the legend of the sensor. And even more so, it is a CCD sensor, which is a different technology than the CMOS sensor that we know and love in most, if not all, modern cameras today. A lot of people rave about the color output of CCD sensors, and I kind of wanted to see what that hype was while it was still available to buy these cameras, on the secondhand market, because they're becoming rarer and rarer, I think, because the parts are running out, so you can't really get most of the main part serviced anymore. So I wanted to kind of see what that hype was about and experience it for myself, while also getting a Leica back in my hands, because I do like the experience of shooting like a rangefinder. And it's not even specific to Leica rangefinders. I like the experience of shooting with most film cameras from the yesteryears. It's just that film is kind of a pain in the ass to shoot, and I just don't want to deal with that post-processing workflow anymore. So here I am using a camera that, from a body and experience use point, feels like using a film camera, but with no hassle of actually having to get the film developed. So that's kind of the reason why I got into this camera, and actually, funny enough, also informs the way I use and intend to continue using this camera. So going back to the CCD sensor in the usable ISO range, I don't go above 640 on this sensor. So 640 ISO is like my top. So with that in mind, I approach this camera like a film camera, where I might load 400 speed film in the camera, and that's it. Work around that as a limitation using your aperture and your shutter speed. I use this camera the same way. Slight difference is that I actually use the auto ISO in this camera. So I think the lowest ISO is like 160, I want to say, and it ranges to 640. So I put it between that range for my auto ISO. I think it does go up to like 20 something hundred, but I keep it to 640, and then I set the minimum shutter speed as 1/30th of a second, which I'm actually really appreciative that this camera, released from like 2006, 2009 or whatever, actually has an auto ISO setting to begin with, and then in that auto ISO setting has a minimum shutter speed, because I've used cameras newer than this from around this time frame that didn't have that. So that's very much appreciated here, and something worth noting if you are thinking about shooting this camera. So going back to that sensor, the output from it, from what I've seen so far within 1 week of shooting or so, is that it actually does have really decent or good resolving power. And I'm not even using it with a good lens. This is not a Leica lens. This is a 7 Artisans Chinese lens. But I'm getting some sharp results from it. I'll show some examples here. But I'm getting sharp results from it. I'm getting very pleasing colors out of camera that don't require a lot of work to look, to my taste. And I'm also getting very good black and white JPEGs out of this camera. And to touch on that, as I talked about earlier with this top LCD that gives you the shot counter, you'll notice that mine is actually on a reasonable number. I have 57 shots left on here. So the way I get that is, me personally, I use a 1 gigabyte SD card, and if you shoot DNG and JPEG, which is RAW and JPEG essentially, that gives you about 62 to 64 shots. So it's kind of like going out with a camera loaded with 2 rolls of film, and I shoot that and just unload it more frequently than I do my big cards, which I actually kind of prefer, because sometimes I kind of forget that I have shots, and I end up not looking at them for months. So another way you can get around that is you can use a bigger SD card and then just put other filler files on it to kind of fill the space up until you get to a number that makes sense to you. And kind of, like I said, to treat this more like a film camera and actually get some utility out of this top LCD that maxes out at 3 digits. So I love that feature of it, having that shot counter, and it kind of gives me a goal towards like, oh, I have this many shots, if I should try to take them, without the pressure or the just a thought in the back of my mind of when I use a film camera, where every time I click it, I know, oh, that's X amount of dollars that I just spent, because it's going to cost me this much to develop and scan that roll of film. So it lets me limit myself like I would with a film camera, but not to the point where I'm afraid to take a shot because I don't want to waste it, right, on anything, because it's going to cost me real money to develop it. So that all adds to the quirkiness and appeal of this camera, in my opinion. And like I said, the colors are really pleasing on the camera. One thing before I wrap up on the colors, the big elephant in the room for those who know about this camera, is that when they developed the sensor, apparently they left out layers that would cut out certain wavelengths of infrared light, IR light, things that you can't really see with the naked eye. And what that led to was kind of inaccurate colors or color casts for certain materials in certain lighting. The most common thing that people would cite was that blacks would look purple or pinkish in sunlight, particularly black man-made fabric, and that greens would kind of go more like a yellow, so foliage would kind of turn like more yellow color. Another one I noticed that I hadn't heard before was I have pictures of my son who was wearing like an olive green shirt outside in the sun, and in every picture I took, that shirt was brown, and it so much so that I didn't even realize, when I reviewed the files, I didn't even realize that the color had changed. I thought he was just wearing a brown shirt, but it came out looking pretty cool. And And the workaround that they implemented for that was that instead of having that layer in front of the sensor, what they did was they encouraged people and even issued filters that would go on the front of your lens, IR cut filters that would filter out those wavelengths of light and then get you back to your accurate color as you would see with your eye. I personally don't use that, and I don't plan on using that because like I said, I plan to approach this camera like a film camera. And when I shoot film, at least me personally, no stocks that I've personally shot, I don't feel like film stocks really reflect the colors I see with my own eyes. It kind of puts its own vibe on top of that scene, at least from what I remember when I shoot film. So colors might not look exactly like they look in real life, but I like them when they come out of those certain film stocks, you know. And I think that's why everyone has their own favorite film stocks, because it might render reds a certain way, this one might do blues a certain way, this one might put a certain cast to the shadows. I just consider the output of this like one of those film quirks where if we had a film stock that turned greens foliage kind of more yellow and turned blacks fabrics kind of purple, and things like that, I don't think nobody would have complained about it. In fact, it probably would have built up a fanfare and people would be, fanboying over that film stock for those quirks and fighting with other people who are fans of other film stocks. So I'm not really concerned about the different color cast of this camera. I plan to embrace it as a, not a feature, but a characteristic of the output of this, just the same way people embrace different characteristics of different film stocks. So it all kind of comes together for me with the experience, the tactility, the mechanical feel, the way this feels like a film camera in the hand, the little things like the shot counter on the top like old film cameras might have, along with the pretty unique color output, as well as the, I will say, pretty amazing black and white JPEG output that a lot of people pin down to that infrared light coming in that gives you unique tonality to your black and white images. So far in the week I've had it, man, I'm here for it. I'm loving every minute of it. Hopefully I'll put up sample images throughout this, but I don't want to make this too long. That is my first impression video of the Leica M8. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, hit me in the comments below. I appreciate all the support, new subscribers, comments, likes, things like that. Even though I've been neglecting you guys, once again, I appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Hopefully I'll see you next time.